Thank you, Jean, and good evening, everyone. It's a delight to be back with you again. And I'm just really thrilled to have this opportunity as your ministry relations officer to talk to you about one of my favorite topics, narrative budgets. So I think some of you probably participated in the webinar that you had about storytelling and the importance of storytelling. Well, this is one of the ways that you can really turbocharge your storytelling and connect it to your mission. And I'm just really excited to talk about it. Many of you are here from near and far. We even have some folks here from California and from Florida, I think. So we want to say a big welcome, and we're so glad that you found us. And I want to say too that you have your own ministry relations officers, and so please connect with them for any follow-up that you may need. Feel free to contact me, but also you have fabulous ministry relations officers. I'm going to share my screen. Please do put any questions you have along the way into the chat. Let's see. Let's get this slideshow on the road. So narrative budgets really work, but one of the challenges, one of the interesting wrinkles to that is that maybe some preliminary work needs to be done so that you define what really matters to your congregation. And we'll be talking about that. So we'll start with the why, and then the what, and then the how. So that's how we're going to structure our time together. I love to begin with prayer and with this scripture, which is Luke 6:38 from the paraphrase version, the Message. Give away your life. You'll find life given back, but not merely given back with bonus and blessing. Giving, not getting is the way. Generosity begets generosity. So let us pray. Lord, open our hearts and our minds and equip us with the tools that we need to encourage generosity and to be able to tell our stories about the impact that our mission and our ministries are having on changing lives. In Jesus' name, be with us in this time together. Amen. As I said, I think the narrative budget is a great tool and it will work in some respects without some of these questions of why and core values and mission that I'm going to lift up. But unless we really do some of that preliminary exploration, what I found is I'll be talking to congregations and I'll mention the narrative budget, and they will say, oh, we tried that and it didn't really do much, or it didn't work for us. And I'll begin to probe and ask, did it connect to the things that are really your deepest values and your DNA of mission? And they'll say, not really, and then I'll say, did you utilize it throughout the year as a structure to tell your stories and report the impact of what you're doing? Or did you just kind of leave it on the table in the narthex? And they kind of get a little sheepish and say, well, yeah, we didn't know that we were supposed to do that. So we really have to begin with some deeper questions like, who are you? Where are you going? What do you have to declare? What are your core values and what is your vision? And some of those conversations should really help you to surface the core areas of your ministry that you want to lift up in the narrative budget. Some of you may have seen this idea before, the hedgehog concept, the intersection, the mapping intersection of what are we deeply passionate about, what can we be the best at, what are our greatest strengths, what do we love to do, what are we great at, and what drives our resource engine. Someone asked, what do you mean by that? And I said, well, where are your sources of resources? Do you have a lot of volunteers? Do you have a lot of energy around your preschool? Do you have a lot of energy around the kind of community outreach that you do? What is really the engine that's driving the resources that you're able to have? Do you have a large endowment? Have you really capitalized on that and you're telling your stories about that? So these are some of the questions that really need to be answered, asked and answered in a way that involves a broad spectrum of the people in your congregation, leadership and people, so that everybody gets a chance to weigh in and everybody feels really good about those structured core categories and values. So here's a sample. Trying to make try to make this a little larger if I can. Here's a church that created a narrative budget, and they really had done that preliminary work about what really matters to us the most about our church. And so they came up with categories for their narrative budget that included radical hospitality, challenging conversations, transforming mission, ties that bind, and nourishing worship. So it's easy to say we care about worship, we care about outreach, we care about fellowship, but they found a way to express it in a way that tapped into their congregation's deepest values and the deepest sense of mission and who they really want to be as a church. And that is why I started out by saying you've got to kind of get at the deeper levels of why this all matters to us and find ways to create categories that will reflect that. And each of them, it will always be unique to who you are as a congregation. Okay, I think I have to shrink this again to get us to move forward. Being mission driven and inspiring. So this is an example from another congregation that had done that deeper work and determined that they wanted everything that they did in their congregation to relate to loving God, loving God's people, and serving the world. And so their narrative budget looks simple, but is really quite deep and quite expansive. And they really understand this concept that everything that they do in the church needs to be able to fit into one of these categories of loving God, loving God's people, and serving the world. This is actually the New River congregation in Philadelphia. And their narrative annual report and narrative budget are both available on their website. And I strongly recommend that you might want to take a look at those resources. Because then you can see that they take that and they apply it to showing the leadership team. They have pictures and images and the beginnings of stories about the things that really matter to them in each of these categories. So their Love God ministry, they have the highlights that include aspects of new members joining the church, expanding their digital ministry, nurturing young families with a new children's worship space. These are the kinds of things that they can hang stories on throughout the year. So you have the Love People ministry. They show the leadership team learning, fellowship, and care. And they talk about the different new developments in Bible study and their morning prayer time and their Lenten observations and their capital campaign and their congregational care. They lift up the things that they're excited about and that will be able to carry stories throughout the year. The same thing they do with the Serve the World ministries. So I think telling the story and showing the story and their narrative annual report is really fantastic. And their use of the narrative budget is fantastic because they can relate it back to the deep work that they did to discern what really mattered to them. Loving God, loving God's people, and serving the world. So the narrative budget is a representation of the line item budget in a simple, easy to read descriptive terms. It transforms a line item of money and expenses into an exciting picture of ministries and missions of the congregation. So that congregation that I referred to, the New River Church, they actually include with their narrative budget a list of frequently asked questions. I took this from their materials. And they answered the question just as I just did. What is a narrative budget? Then they refer in why use it to research studies that indicate that churches fail to communicate the value of the ministries that they provide and the changes occurring in people's lives through their ministries. So the contributors have a limited understanding of how to use their gifts, how the use of their gifts is really benefiting the things that they love about the church. So the narrative budget is designed to explicitly connect giving with the church's ministry stories and ministry activities. And then the question of, do Presbyterians use narrative budgets? Well, we have tools for them. We've created in the Stewardship Navigator a narrative budget generator. So yes, Presbyterians are using narrative budgets. And then the question that's probably on all of your minds, does the narrative budget replace the line item budget? No, it will never replace the line item budget. We're not trying to take that away. You need a line item budget to create the narrative budget, and it's a necessary tool for your finance ministries and for your sessions. So you'll always have the line item budget, but it doesn't tell the story effectively as the narrative budget. Where are the administrative costs? That's another frequent question. Where do we put the administrative costs in the narrative budget? The administrative expenses are included for this church, they explain, in their 3 areas of mission. We do not separate category for administration in the narrative budget because administration is not a mission area in and of itself. Rather, administration is a tool that serves our mission. That's a great explanation because that's a question. I usually get drafts of narrative budgets. I'd be glad to look at yours before you finalize it. It'd be one of the sets of eyes that looks at it. And oftentimes I still see the familiar categories from the line item budget. And that is not a narrative budget. What's the purpose of the narrative budget? To communicate, to help members of the congregation understand how the key areas of their mission, loving God, loving people, and serving the world, are where their dollars are going. And they say, what should I know about giving to New River? Every dollar that's given to New River is allocated to one of these 3 areas of mission: loving God, loving people, and serving the world. So that the work that they've done to define who they are and what matters to them, you're then able to say, every dollar you give us goes to support one of the areas that you have said you love about our church. What should I know about giving to New River? And I mentioned that already, but if I would like a line item budget, how can I request it? And that's also very important. It's important for people to know that you're not trying to hide, you're not trying to not be transparent, you're not trying to take away the line item budget, but you're coming forward first and foremost with a budget that inspires and tells a story about what really matters to the people in the pews and to the congregation, and how their dollars are being used to support a pastor, yes, but the pastor does the things they love and care about. So the building, yes, but the building does the things they love and care about. And so that is something that you want to do too. Let people know that they can always get the line item budget and tell them how to do it. I share this picture because it kind of demonstrates some current research on how our brains process information. Through language lights up 2 sections of our brain, the Wernicke's area on language comprehension and the Broca's area on language processing, very important areas. But when you start to tell stories, all of these different parts of the brain light up, not just language comprehension, but colors and shapes and scents and sounds and movement and all the rest, in addition to the language areas of the brain, begin to light up. One way that I like to demonstrate that is with this illustration. So you get 7 people plus 1 dog plus 1 car. And then you get this wonderful image of a painting by Norman Rockwell. I have to tell you that I never thought I'd say this, but I am the Gigi in the back seat of the car. Recently I did some traveling with my children and grandchildren, and I found myself probably making this face sometimes. The Gigi in the back seat. Um, but so I just love this picture because you see the kids having, doing the things that they're doing. And it's so different than just that equation. Seven people, one dog, one car. You get so much more information from an image like this. And that is what the narrative budget can do. It evokes this image evokes so much emotion in us because we all recognize it and we can all place ourselves in it someplace. So the question really is this beginning with this why, what is our story? What is it that we do well in our church, in our community, and in the world? What do we love? And how are we participating with Christ? As I said, the line item budget will continue to be a popular tool and a necessary tool. And most of us are so familiar with it as an accounting tool. It assigns expenses into categories, uses number coding, presented in a grid in a spreadsheet. I was a ruling elder at the age of 14 in my home church and started reading budgets familiar like this one. This is the familiar structure of a line item budget. It will always be used for our accounting, but it just doesn't tell the effective story. It doesn't show how money is being invested in lives, in changing lives. It doesn't show how volunteer time and talents are impacting the church. It should be used by session. The narrative budget and your finance team, the narrative budget is a visioning tool. It shows the programs of the church having a positive impact. It inspires and it helps us to reframe finances to be about ministry, which is really the message you need folks to have because that's what they really want to support. So the narrative budget equips your church to use ministry categories rather than line items, to reframe gifts as investments in ministry instead of just the light bill, inspire givers by showing impact, and increase financial resources for the ministry. It shows your vision and your core values shining through. So, what are the steps? How do you create a narrative budget? First, you would define your budget components of your personnel and your staff. Then you would define the number of ministry areas that you want your church to tell stories about. Areas like worship, mission, fellowship, music, whatever really matters to your church. But then as I started out and I said, once you've defined them with the sort of generic names, you want to somehow personalize and make them special within the life of your congregation. They'll work if you don't, but they'll be so much more powerful if you do. For each area, you want to develop lists of stories, um, identify who can really share that story, those stories most effectively, and how you can share those stories, how many different ways you can share stories based on the framework of the narrative budget. So if you were to select mission ministry categories such as worship, education or spiritual formation, mission or outreach, fellowship or nurture, and pastoral care, and there are just an infinite number that you could choose because every church is different, these categories will not match up with your budget categories. Did I say that clearly enough? These categories, these new categories that you're choosing, are going to tap into the areas in the life of the church that people really love the most and that you love, the DNA of your church, what you really need to be doing to be the church that you recognize and that you love. They won't necessarily match up. They may in some areas. I mean, worship is fairly ubiquitous, But how do you put the spin, the unique spin on worship that really make it what matters to your congregation? These categories will not necessarily match your budget categories. We have a tool called the Narrative Budget Creator, which is embedded in the Stewardship Navigator. I put that link in the chat, and it's also on a resource sheet that I sent earlier to the Presbytery. So those should be up on the website already, some resources. And I'll be talking more about this, but I'll also be talking about a general approach to how to create a narrative budget. Some people like the electronic tool and others don't. So I'm going to present it both ways. So all of your line items, you need the line item budget first, and your line items are assigned or split up into one or more categories. So your salaries, which you'll decide how you're going to set those up. Usually at least the pastor salary is separated out, but sometimes other salaries are separated out as well, and sometimes those are all grouped together. Salaries are assigned across the categories of the mission categories that you've chosen. If you come across something like youth ministry, you can decide should that go in education or fellowship and education or missions. Depending on what categories you've chosen, you'll decide where different elements of the line item budget, the different lines would fit best. And you add or modify categories to fit your ministry, as I've said already. And usually it's best to keep it to 3 to 5 different categories. So let's say for this example, the first example I'm going to offer to you, worship and education and mission and fellowship and pastoral care are your categories, your mission ministry categories. Do you see administration anywhere? Nope. We want to warn you that using administration or building or debt or infrastructure as a category in your narrative budget will undermine the impact of this ministry resource and render your efforts ineffective. It won't change the paradigm. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People and how they talk about making a paradigm shift. The shift from a line item budget is a paradigm shift. You're shifting from an approach of adding up the numbers and all the little detail and all the minutia to pulling back and showing the big picture of what really matters to your congregation and telling it through images and stories and infographics that communicate the importance of their giving. And so we beg you not to go there. Do not keep the administrative category or the building or debt or infrastructure, any of the kind of things that you may think you have to keep. So then you would create a column for each category, format your cells as percentages, distribute the different categories of the line item budget, the cost by percentage across the categories, distribute percentages of line items into category columns. And as I mentioned, some of them will be easy, like Sunday school supplies to education. A pastor might spend their time in this manner. This is just a general, this is not a rule for you to follow. You need to ask your pastor, once you set up the categories, what their best guess as to the amount of time that they spend in each of them. 30% on worship, 15% on education, 10% on mission, 10% on fellowship, 20% on pastoral care. This distribution will inform other expense lines. It may make sense to keep it in other expense lines. And then building usage obviously will influence some expenses. Okay. We want to ask you not to try to make this add up to the penny the way that you do your line item budget. It may not do that. It probably won't do that. We want you to avoid the accuracy trap. We would like to let you know that detailed accuracy in a narrative budget is less important than being descriptive, educational, and inspirational. and tapping into those deeper core values that we've been talking about. We want you to accept that the results will have a positive impact on donors, even when based on some generalizations. You don't have to make sure this adds up to the penny. So here's an example. So if music and worship is 4,500, education and spiritual formation or 6,000, mission 28,000, membership in small groups 2,000. Obviously, the largest items in any budget are tend to be pastoral compensation and building costs. That's the case here, property and programs and communication. Here is a chart that you want to take a minute to look at with me, and that shows how you would, the categories that we talked about are across the top: worship, education, mission, fellowship, and pastoral care. What you then do is you assign a percentage. You have your categories from that I just mentioned earlier that you've taken from your line item budget. Sometimes you've compiled them together. So mission might have several different items in it, but in this case, you've added them all up and they total 28,000. And you have that down, the what we used to call the X axis, the sort of Y axis at the top, or the labels at the top, or your categories. And then you go across and you assign percentages based on some research that you do. You research and you discuss with the pastor how much you spend, how much of your time and energy do you spend in worship, education, mission, fellowship, pastoral care. There'll be obvious things like your music and worship budget will go 100% in music and worship. Your Christian and spiritual formation will go 100% in education. Your mission budget will go, generally speaking, although there could be some debate about this, 100% in mission. Your membership in small groups investments will go in fellowship. And then you'll divide up all the rest. And you'll assign the rest of in this case, the example has the rest of the salaries, no matter what they are, under staff, parish, other staff. And you divide those up with assigned percentages. You assign your property costs across the board to one of the mission areas because the building supports mission. And so you across the board, you make your best research and your best assignments so that people can see and be reminded that the building supports our mission and ministries. Programs and communications, the same thing. And then you have the total of what this church's budget would be. And then you're going to add another set of ministry category columns. You're going to multiply the percentage column by the budget line item amount. Whatever percentage you came up with, you need to kind of multiply the percentage by the line item amount so that then you can come up with dollar figures. And you're going to total the ministry categories columns, and the column totals are ministry category totals. This is another chart that you're going to want to look at pretty carefully. So that you see how you wind up with your ultimate percentages is by adding up each column. Once you've done your multiplication and you've filled in this chart so that you can see, here's your budget, those line item numbers that you aggregated together. Here's, where mission landed. Here's where you've applied the multiplication of the percentages across each category. And then you add up down at the bottom, you get a total for each of your mission ministry areas. And in this case, it's 29% for worship, 24% for education, 22% for mission, 14% for fellowship care, and 11% for pastoral care. And then you can create, through the magic of an Excel spreadsheet, you can create a pie chart that will immediately communicate to people that if they give $1 to their church, 22% goes to mission, 24% goes to education, 29% goes to amazing worship that they love, 11% goes to amazing pastoral care that they couldn't live without, 14% goes to fellowship, which they love. That's usually the first thing that people tell me that brings them the most joy in the life of their church, their relationships and their fellowship with each other. So showing people that that's where their dollars are going to support the things that they love about their church is really critical. And the pie chart can also give you new information. If you're a church that loves mission, but you can't figure out how to get it to show that in the pie chart, then maybe you need to stop and ask, are we doing enough? Are we allocating enough for the things that we really care about as a church? So it can be a self-evaluation and also an affirmation. Look, we're doing even more than we thought we were. This is another example. Let me go back. This is another example. Well, that didn't help. I think I need to get rid of this at the top here. Okay, so this is another example from a church that I worked with that created this is their work that they did that created their narrative budget. And both of those I sent, both of these, their sort of work product and their narrative budget I sent along to the presbytery. So they're there as samples. Um, and so in this congregation, you can see that they did all the work. They created the percentages. They took their line item budget and collapsed the categories in slightly different ways than the previous example. But they came up with their percentages in the same way. And it's helpful to see step by step how that would be done. And then they came up with they had previously come up with their categories of music and worship, spiritual growth, community outreach, fellowship. And in their case, making disciples was very important. So they included that one. Then you create narratives to go with each of the ministry areas. You look for images and pictures that would be compelling, that move people, where people can see the work that's being done in each area. And you add descriptions and stories about the ministry categories. I started out by showing you an example of how the New River congregation, just a tidbit, is much, much more in their annual narrative, annual report, and narrative budget, as you can see if you go to their website and take a look. But you share compelling, this is where the storytelling comes in. You start to tell stories about those ministry areas that you've done all that line item work and created your percentages and your pie chart that tells infographics tell a great story. For example, the pastoral care narrative could be about taking communion to 3 local nursing homes each month and the lives that are being touched there, on call at 2 local hospitals, and follow-up care for parishioners recovering from illness and surgery, and maybe some testimonials there. Preparation with the members for baptisms, weddings, funerals, and perhaps some testimonials there. You collect the stories and testimonials that go along with each ministry category. You begin to perhaps tell sacred stories with permission, with people's permission. Sometimes people want it to be known how the church has made a difference in their lives. And so this is an example of a story of a young mom who's new to the community and who feels the church has been like family to her. You want to find ways to collect stories that connect to the areas, the ministry areas you're talking about. And you get the story out in other ways. Once you have the narrative budget, you utilize these categories in stories in your church newsletter, in bulletin inserts, in church website, in stewardship mailings, in narrative budget booklets, in personal contact, in videos, in talks, dare I say, and include them in prayer. Find ways to lift up the ministry areas as often as you can in as many different ways as you can. So things like putting a bulletin insert out each week for 6 weeks, highlighting a different category of ministry right after you've shared the narrative budget. So it reinforces to people that they'll be hearing about these ministry areas. You pray for that ministry. You make an active prayer ministry. Tell a specific story of a person being touched by that ministry. All of these things you make as a regular calendar, year-round calendar. That really is what we think is a year-round stewardship effort. Um, an advanced version might even codify all your volunteer hours and add them to your narrative budget. And there's a couple of slides here for doing that, but I'm going to kind of skip past them a little bit. But the key challenging recommendation is to be determined to talk about money and ministry in a new way, and to experiment with getting away from the line item budget being the main thing that people look to understand how the church's money is being spent. The process will continue by quarterly review, updating and expanding upon stories and talent recognition. Your generosity team, which is something we'll talk about in the stewardship webinar, your generosity team should constantly be collecting stories about these different categories in your narrative budget and helping to get that interpretation shared. Eventually, people will begin to think of the church ministry funding as ministry, that what they give to the church is actual ministry, making a difference in people's lives. And that's the goal. So the keys to success are to be prayerful, celebrate your church, be visionary, communicate about this process so that people don't feel that it's not transparent, involve as many people as you can, talk about funding ministry, not raising funds, and be really inviting and invite people to this journey of generosity and also be challenging. Now, there is a narrative description of how to do the things that I've just described. It's an article, and some people love that. But we also have a narrative budget brochure creator. And there is a worksheet that will walk you through the different mission area, ministry areas that you can choose, how you enter the line items in your budget into this generator, how you then allocate the line items with the percentages that I've talked about. That's another slide of that. And then it talks you through, it leads you through sections where you create the content that will be in the brochure. Things like your address and congregation name, your pastor's information, your treasurer's information, writing a brief about us section, which hopefully will be inspirational and touch on the ministry areas that you love and care about. Write an overview of recent stewardship activity where you're positive and don't say we're in the hole, people, but say, we are doing great things. We want to do even more great things next year. And there are prompts and guides for you to write these things embedded in the budget, the narrative budget generator. Write and customize a brief summary of each of your mission ministry areas, and customize your scripture passage because there's a scripture passage included, and customize your front page image. You can change the graphics, you can customize them. The New River Church that I said was a great example used this narrative budget generator to generate their narrative budget. And it is a great tool. And if you run into any difficulty with it, just reach out to me. We have technical advisors that can help you. So I have included in this presentation these different aspects of the worksheet, but I've also sent it as a separate document. We have resources, the Stewardship Navigator, the Church Financial Leadership Academy. If you find yourself thinking, how do I really explain this to the members of my finance team or the members of my session. We have a short video on the narrative budget included in the Church Financial Leadership Academy, along with all different topics, short videos about financial topics. And we also have a conference, which I hope you know about, which is the Stewardship Kaleidoscope. This is an overview of all the things that I normally offer and do. And now it's time for questions and comments. So I'll stop sharing and see what kinds of questions have been coming up. Jean,
I have not seen any in the chat. Do you have any questions?
any questions that you'd like to unmute and share?
Quiet group.
Hi, I'm gonna try and put on my video.
Hey, Chris.
Hi, Rose. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Hanging in there, doing the best we can. Uh, my name's Chris Doyle. I'm the pastor at Oak Ridge and West Milford Presbyterian. And my question is, how do you really address the positive that, that look at our community, all of this, when a lot of the mentality tends to be more survival mode?
Yeah, I understand that. I think I think that what we have to do is we have to begin to plan this, shift the conversation. We have to shift the conversation in the direction of what brings us joy in the life of our church, what brings us, what are we proud of about the ministries of our church. You know, I was with a church that I really love and that I know very well, and the leadership that I know very, very well. And I did a workshop similar to this. And I had asked the leaders what brought them joy currently, what was bringing them joy in their ministry. And one of the key leaders came up to me and said, offline, he didn't say it in the group, but he said, he came separately to me and he said, I can't think of anything. And that's not good. And I said, yes, let's pray. And that's information. It's information that really points to a kind of a crisis in the life of the church or the life of the individual. I actually said to him, um, well, you know, session members chair committees. What committee are you chairing? And with a great sigh, he said, sort of huffed it out. He said, buildings and grounds. And I said, Sam, I made up that name. That's not his name. I said, Sam, you love Christian education. And I noticed on the back of your bulletin that there's nobody, apparently nobody chairing Christian education. That must be devastating to you. And you have a big decision to make. Do you trust that someone else will be raised up by God to do, to support property and grounds and move over to Christian education, which is your true love? We know that about you, I don't know that that has happened, but he's still leading the church in many wonderful ways. So I would say it's diagnostic. If the struggle is too great to identify the joys and the positives, it's really got to be worked at and drilled down to what is getting in our way from celebrating the amazing things that we're doing as a church. Because so many of our churches are doing so much that's truly amazing. So being able to really authentically, this is the reason why I started out with the sort of why, leading with the core values and the core vision. Now, if there's a disconnect between these are our things that we love, but we're not getting to do them for some reasons, that's also diagnostic. That's why at some point in the presentation, it talks about this can really serve as a way to self-evaluate.
Well, I want to say something here. While when Joseph asked his question, why don't you all think about what is one story you can tell that could go with your budget? And, you don't have to give us the whole story, but a gist of it and put it in the chat. Put in your story, the one, we don't even have to explain it, but just put a story in the chat of those things that you want to tell with your budget. Okay, Joseph, go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, hi, Rose. I'm Joe Riggs. I'm one of Chris's bandits in the Oak Ridge Presbyterian Church. We've met on another occasion when you presented equally well, by the way. So thank you very much. So, and I think I'll confess to being the leader of the band in a non-narrative budget that tells all of our problems and seeks to remedy them, and we haven't had great success, using that approach. So what you're describing is very interesting. Let me ask, kind of a reality check, because here we are in our church starts their budget process right about now, and if you're lucky, you get it all done by November or December, and get it before the congregation in January or December, get it approved, yada yada yada. And this process, I mean, it feels like the right one, but it feels like a long one. And what would you suggest, if we were to say to you, okay, this is, we want to go down this route, and it's going to take us X number of months or quarters or whatever. What would you suggest in terms of a shorter term action plan that could be used this year? Realizing that it would be an evolving process. I'm just curious to bring us to a world of pragmatism, if you could, and what you've seen with others, and really get. And by the way, our church typically has a worship audience of about 40 members, so it's not a situation where we can just do a call to arms and expect that we're going to get a couple dozen people. We're going to get 5 or 6 people. So A, we've got limited human resource, and B, we've got limited time, at least in this year's context. So give us some sense of your perspectives in that regard.
I will. And I will also say that I think I might have skipped a slide early on in the presentation. Somehow I think I skipped over, I think I had included the New River Church actually has a little infographic that shows how they develop their narrative budget step by step, and they make it so that it's not that onerous of a process, I think. So I'm going to answer your question, but then I'm also going to take a quick gander back and see if I can find that slide to share. Yes, I think it can feel like a big shift. Once when I was a young pastor, a seasoned pastor told me, if you're going to make a big change, you want to teach about it, preach about it, and pray about it before you make the big change. You don't want to be so abrupt, with people, with something like this. But you can do a milder version, perhaps, by creating your ministry categories, doing that preliminary work to uncover what really matters to us most as of a church, or really what Jean was saying in terms of where would your best stories, one question would be, where do we have our great stories? The food outreach that we do, the family ministries that we do, the fellowship that we offer, the pastoral care. Nobody feels left out in our congregation when they have a need. Someone's always watching out for them and visiting them. Where do you have those great stories that tap into the vein of what people really love about your church? And just set up your ministry categories and test them out, and test them out as part of your stewardship campaign in the fall, that you're telling stories based on those ministry categories. And meanwhile, set up a little task force that starts working on how do we turn this into our narrative budget. Maybe not a retrospective one, but a prospective one. That doesn't have to, you'll adopt a line item budget just like you will every year. Once that line item budget is adopted, you experiment over the course of the year, turning it into that storytelling vehicle that can carry things throughout the year. Have it approved by session. I'm going to pause there and say, give me additional questions or feedback while I take another look, do my little look for that slide that I think I overlooked here. Sorry about that. Any further comments to be had?
Rosa, I have a question here. Bill Burdick from West Side and Ridgewood.
Hi, Bill.
Hi.
We share some history together.
Yes, we do.
And
It's
a
been a
dear
long
friend.
time, many years. Uh, how do you allocate, let's say, some of your property expenses, whether it can just be electricity, whether it can be heating and whatever? We are a fairly sizable congregation, and we have multiple programs where I can see that we could list them in categories. Are there any tips per se as to how to allocate some of those expenses?
Right, right. Well, I think you take a look at your overall activities in the church. Um, I think goes back to this idea that it's not going to be accurate to the penny the way that your line item budget is. So that what a lot of narrative budgets do is they take all those categories, they don't treat them separately. They just put them together as building costs. And then they start to get a feel for how much of their building is used in each of those areas: worship, mission. And when I say mission, maybe people aren't coming to you, but you're being equipped to go out and do mission as well. So you don't have to be like, well, the building's not really used for mission, but our people are involved in mission and they're being equipped in the building for mission. So there's lots of different ways to really think this through. And you want to just show people that all of those building costs, insurance, electricity, all those building costs, and the use of the building for the things that we love and care about. Pastoral care happens in this building. We don't necessarily get to hear about it all the time because oftentimes it's confidential. But you say to your pastor, how much pastoral care is going on in this building? How much of the preparation for pastoral care when your deacons get together and go out to carry communion? All the things that are happening, you kind of develop a guesstimate and assign a certain percentage. And as you look at it, the first time you do it, you may say, gosh, we wish we used the building more for these things. How could we use the building more for these things? What more could we be doing? Or even the pastor starts to pray and think, how could I be doing more in these categories? Or the other groups, the mission groups or your outreach groups start to think, gosh, how could we make better use of the pastor's time? We want to get in front of the pastor to be talking about our mission goals more often. So, there can be real growth from these things. So that's why I think you don't want to necessarily get so caught in the detail. I bet you there's somebody at some point in the history of narrative budgets that went around and measured every amp of electricity and tried to attribute it to one of the mission areas. That would not be a good use of everybody's time. You want to get as close as you can, as reasonable, best shot at making those distributions.
Well, I think the bottom line is we recognize there's a high level of subjectivity in
There
creating.
absolutely is a high level of subjectivity, but if you're tapping into the things people love the most and the things that really matter the most to the church, then you'll be telling the stories that matter.
Yeah.
That's really the key.
Yeah. Thank you.
Other questions? I will say that that slide that I thought I had skipped is actually missing. I must have put it maybe in a different draft of but I will restore it before I send before I send the slides to the presbytery. So it will be there. And it just kind of shows, okay, the typical thing where you have the committees tell you what their expenses are going to be, and then you evaluate your income and your expenses, and then you take that to the finance committee, and then you take it to the session, and then you create the narrative version of the budget. So basically, the line item budget and the narrative budget are both created and both approved, but in different steps by the right people. But really, it's the line item budget that's created first, and then the narrative budget is like almost the penultimate step in the process. And then both budgets are finalized by session. So there's a kind of a timeline of how you would create it. And somehow it slipped out of my presentation. I'm sorry about that. But this example came from New River, which I think was, again, something that I'm holding up for you as something that I hope that you'll all go take a look at. Because I love their narrative budget and I love their their narrative annual report, which is another thing I think is a cool resource for storytelling.
Rose, there's a question in the chat. We've used our vision statement. We've begun working on our narrative budget. We've used our vision statement to outline our categories. However, we have a foundation level that supports all our categories for all the necessary building use expenses. Is that a mistake?
I'm trying to see if I can read it.
It's the very last one.
Huh. I can't seem to see it. So would you read it again?
We use our vision statement to outline our categories for our narrative budget. However, we have a foundation, in quotes, level that supports all our categories for all the necessary building use expenses. Is that a mistake? They have a category called foundation level. So is that right, April?
Foundation level. Well, first of all, it's great to use your vision statement to create your categories, but you need to back check your vision statement and be sure that it's not so aspirational that it doesn't touch people's hearts in the area that they really love. Some of our vision statements are, we are a welcoming church of Jesus Christ, and our folks don't love strangers. You know, I hate to say it, but you need to double check that you're being accurate to the things that people really love in your church. I'm not sure what's really meant by foundational level, so that becomes hard to answer the question. If April would clarify that, but I think I saw something about her having difficulty with her internet in one of the
Hello, can you
comments.
hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
April.
Okay.
April.
Yeah,
Yes.
I have an unstable, I keep losing part of your presentation because it's unstable here, my internet. My question is really about how we did not divide into percentages all of the building use expenses. So what we did was create this foundation which supports all of our categories. One, seeking connections, which incorporates worship and all the different areas that you talked about, but we aligned it with our vision statement. So, and the foundation then is all of those things like the electric, the water, rather than having to divide up with, because there's so many things that go on at our church that to try to figure out percentages for all of those things was a little bit daunting. So we created this, what we call the foundation, so that, and in the visual, if you see the foundation along the bottom, and then our categories that come out of that foundation level, that's how we would visually present it so that they could see, all of those expenses in one place.
Totally understand that. Totally get it. It's totally what we're begging you not to do.
Okay.
Totally get it, and we all have to decide what battles to fight, and I'm not suggesting that you change it overnight necessarily, but I am suggesting that it really is what we're asking you not to do, because those foundational costs, there are folks in churches, just like there were folks when I worked for Austin Seminary in our capital campaign that said, there are folks who'll say, I don't really love buildings. And there are folks who say, I don't really understand why we're spending so much on a pastor's salary. Why do we really need a pastor? And what a narrative budget does is it gets to the fact that the building supports the missions that they love, the ministries that they love. And the pastor is doing the ministries that they love and the missions that they love. And every other item in the budget. Remember, I quoted from what they had in the narrative, the frequently asked questions for the New River Church, where they say, where are our administrative costs? They are in each of the categories. We love God, we love God's people, and we serve the world. And that's where they belong. And we are very firm on that. We really believe that you may have taken a step, but it is a step that's still protecting the idea that we have these fundamental expenses that in and of themselves people should love. We are more and more living in a world where people do not give money to those fundamental expenses that we think they should love. They want to support the ways in which the dollars that they're giving to the causes that they're giving them to are changing lives and making a difference. And the more we try to protect that old way of setting out the information, the more we are resisting the ways in which people are supporting their nonprofits. They're supporting their colleges and universities. They're doing it based on the stories that they're hearing about how people's lives are being changed and how their dollars are making a difference. They're not that excited about paying for the electrical bill. So the more we resist finding ways to assign those costs to our ministry areas, and yes, got to get it somewhat realistic, but not have big battles about, should it lean this way or should it lean that way?
Chris?
I was just going to say that when you were speaking, it was reminding me of what I had heard on NPR earlier this morning about how there's been an incredible outpouring of support to NPR because of everything going on. And the way they had been doing that was for the last week and a half, they had been running story after story after story of people telling about the effect of NPR on their lives. And it's the same exact example that kind of you're bringing here today, and it's helping them greatly.
Absolutely. Absolutely. What would I have done without Sesame Street when my daughter was little? You know, so, um,
Anti-Roadshow.
mhm. Anyone else? I am your ministry relations officer. I can review drafts, I can meet with committees, I can um, you help you when you get stuck with another point of view or another perspective. I am available to guide and support the work that you're doing, and just to really, or even the question about mission and vision, which, as I say, is the big why. If you need to be jump started into that conversation, that's another area that I can be supportive, because we believe that money follows mission and vision. The more you focus on those things, the more people will give generously. As well as you celebrate, like the example that you gave, Chris, where your church is getting busy and detailing and loving the sanctuary and starting to see other ways that they can love the sanctuary. That kind of community building should be part of your celebration, that we work together and we make a difference together, and part of that is fellowship, and part of it is, honoring God together. So how you design your ministry categories, if you have a great story that doesn't fall into one, either make it fit, because there are ways to shift it around to make it fit, or it's fine to tell some great stories that don't fit into one of these categories. Maybe that helps you to tweak the categories for next time. Well, I
Well,
know we've gone a little bit over, Jean,
yeah,
but
a
as I
little
said,
bit.
this is something that I'm really passionate about and love to work with folks on. So.
Any other questions before we close? Well, thank you everyone for joining us for another video. This will be posted. It'll be, as soon as I can get a time, it will be posted on the webpage, and we'll let you know what it is. Our next one I put in the chat is September 3rd. Hope to see you there. The registration is open on that, so you can register for that one also. All right. Thank you, Rose, again, for all that you do for us and all that you've been doing for our project. So let us pray. Gracious God, we give you thanks for this time together, and we give you thanks for the ministry of Rose and the foundation as they work to support our congregations in doing their mission and ministry. We ask that you be with each of these congregations and churches as they continue to find ways to best serve you. We ask this all in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. And thank
Again,
you very much, Rose.
You're welcome. I want to underscore Stewardship Navigator. There are additional examples there. Call on me for resources.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.